What does the building shown in the picture have to do with the domestic automobile industry? Well, as you can see the sign over top of this factory in Philadelphia, it says Edward G. Budd Manufacturing Company Automobile Bodies. This is the Budd Company, if you've never heard of them. But the Budd Company was a dominating force in automotive manufacturing for a number of years after its founding in 1913. More specifically, the Budd Company was really the company that developed a lot of ways to manufacture bodies with high quality. In fact, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the advances that they made on later vehicles. But for a long time, they actually ended up building bodies starting off for Chrysler and the Dodge brothers. And here's a more modern picture of the former Budd Company facility. The Budd Company went belly up in 2014, but a lot of its operations had become part of Thyssen and ThyssenKrupp, and eventually, I think some parts of it were sold to Martin Rehe. But regardless, it's no longer around. But in particular, by the 1960s, I would say the Budd Company was a pretty dominant force in automotive manufacturing, capitalizing on a reputation that started all the way back in those teens of the 20th century. And while the Budd Company was an automobile producer for many years before the 1930s, I think it became especially popular after it really did the design work for the body on the Citroën Traction Avon, which was a front-wheel drive vehicle that came out. This car, take a guess what year this car is from. It's pretty hard to believe, but actually this car that you see here was introduced in 1934 by Citroën, and it had a unitized body structure. That's right, this is not a body-on-frame construction. This was the first mass-produced car to have a unitized body in the world, and it was engineered by the Budd Company and licensed by Citroën back during that time frame. By the way, this particular car was produced all the way into the 1950s. So, it just shows you how popular it was and how timeless its styling was as well. Now, in the U.S., the Budd Company also helped another company pioneer unitized construction, and that was Nash with the 1941 Nash 600. The car was so named because it could allegedly travel 600 m on one tank of gas, in part because it was the first American car to have a unitized body structure and enabled considerable weight savings of time. Now, Nash from a marketing standpoint said the car was not only lighter, leading to fuel efficiency gains, but it also endowed the car with fewer creaks and rattles, and also made it quieter because it didn't have those creaks and rattles. Some of that might have been true, but for those who have ridden in the early unibody cars, I don't know that I would necessarily take one over a body-on-frame car. In particular, I don't find the road isolation to generally be as great as the body-on-frame cars. But oh well. In any case, this particular Nash 600, as I said, that came out in 1941, was really the first American car that Budd became known as an innovator for because of what I previously mentioned. Now, as time went on and you get into the 1950s and 1960s, the Budd Company certainly expanded its reach. As I mentioned, it started out with a relationship with the Dodge brothers, but then branched out even overseas to Citroën and then Nash as well as other companies. And by the 1950s and 1960s, the Budd Company was producing automobile bodies for a significant number of car companies. It still had the relationship with Chrysler, and as you can see in this advertisement here, they mention that they are producing automobile bodies for them and have for some time. And if you look in this advertisement for the Budd Company, you see a number of vehicles, and they say wherever you look, you see Budd, and there's a Cadillac. The individual who's driving is sitting in a Lincoln. You can see a Ford and some various vehicles on the roadway. So, I'm not quite sure which of these were Budd Company vehicles. Aside from the Lincoln, they definitely made sheet metal for Lincoln, and then Chrysler products as well as I mentioned, and some Ford products. We're going to talk a little bit more about the Ford products in particular right now. And that's because the Budd Company supplied Lincoln with sheet metal for a good period of time, including on my Mark III that you see here, where the exterior body panels were fabricated by the Budd Company. And this was something that continued on Lincoln for a period of time. The Mark III, the Mark V, I know that those used sheet metal stampings from the Budd Company in particular. And one of the reasons for this was not only capacity at the Ford Motor Company, but also because Ford wanted very high-quality stampings with tight tolerances so that the gaps were all uniform across the vehicles. This was something that you just didn't see on the other Fords, although the Thunderbird that you see here is pretty good. In any case, it was interesting that Lincoln turned to Bud for the Mark cars like my Mark III, where they knew that the quality of the stampings was going to be high. And I have to say, you see all the gaps on the car and the Lincoln, they're pretty perfect for the time frame. You know, maybe there are some better gaps on cars now, but back then it was hard to find a car with uniform gaps all over the place, and gaps that weren't 8 millimeters here, and then 2 millimeters there. But the vehicles that wore Bud Company stampings really were a cut above the rest in most cases, particularly the Lincoln. And I have to say, if you're going to buy a high-quality domestic car from the late 1960s, early 1970s, you really can't do much better than the Mark III that you see here. This is my 1969 Mark III. All the Mark IIIs, the 69,771, are all just excellent, super high-quality automobiles, and really good fit and finish all over in materials. Great cars overall. Now, the Mark V that you see here also had stampings made by the Bud Company, but unfortunately Ford kind of significantly degraded the material quality on the Mark Versus. The exterior stampings were great. And notice how beautiful the overall, let's say, gaps are on this car that you can see. They're tight, they're uniform, but the inside of the Mark V was kind of let down, as was to me the car itself. It just doesn't drive nearly as nicely as the Mark III. It's very quiet on the inside, but it's just a very water-beddy ride. The Mark III is soft, but the Mark V is, I would say, too soft to be honest. And they all drive that way. It's kind of like I said, you're sitting on a water bed, and a very cramped and claustrophobic water bed at that, because there's not a lot of glass area in these cars. It's kind of like sitting in a modern-day sports car, and you don't even get a standard passenger side, outside, rear view mirror. So they're pretty hard to see out of as well, at least if you're merging or trying to get into a lane to the right of you or turning right and try to look to see if there's anything beside you. And while customers definitely benefited from the Bud Company sheet metal stampings and the good quality there, the Bud Company was also proud of an affiliation with Lincoln and the work that it did on these Continentals. As you can see in this particular advertisement, where they highlight their work on the 69 Mark III, that, by the way, has the same color combination as mine. And you can tell it's a 69 because it's got the exposed wipers. The 70 and 71 have hidden wipers. And on this notice, it says new mark of authority, the Continental Mark III. And the ad also calls out that the Bud Company is making parts for 29 different cars. Not sure what the other 29 were. But certainly the affiliation with Lincoln was one. As I said, they were proud of and one that dated back even a few years, even dating back to this particular advertisement for the 1964 Continental, which incidentally was also a unibody car. In fact, Lincoln went to unibody construction in 1958, when it introduced the all-new vehicles with kind of cane headlamp look. Those, believe it or not, despite their 131 in wheelbase, are unibody vehicles. They're absolutely massive, and the Bud Company was a key supplier there. I suspect that Lincoln contracted with them after the success that Bud had on the Nash vehicles. And well, Bud helped certainly with the engineering and executed quite a bit of the stamping of those 1958 vehicles. And I think that was really the start of a great relationship between Bud and Lincoln that continued on into the previously mentioned Mark III, as well as Mark V. Now, the Bud Company did more than just automotive. They produced rail cars, among other things. But the key focus for this particular video was just helping educate the viewer about a key supplier that really helped improve the quality and deliver high-quality products to a number of vehicles. Most particularly, I would say the Lincoln lineup. And if you look at Lincolns and the gaps that they have, and you compare it to the Cadillacs of the era of the Lincoln, I have to admit, are just better. They're better built. They have better stamping quality. And they really are just beautiful vehicles in part because of the work the Bud Company did. Hope you enjoyed this little feature on a key automotive supplier back in the day, the Bud Company.